The Civil War soldier's life consisted of bad food, loneliness, and atrocious medical care for a start, but there were also bright spots, like baseball. This is what life was really like for Civil War soldiers. The diet of a Civil War soldier was pretty unappealing. Soldiers received one of two kinds of rations: camp rations or marching rations. Marching rations were larger, but both usually consisted of about a pound of either salt pork or fresh meat, along with bread, beans, rice, sugar, vegetables, and coffee. If you were a commissioned officer, you also had access to extra goods in the brigade commissary that normal soldiers didn't. Hardtack, a dry biscuit that consisted only of flour and water, was plentiful but unappetizing. According to Union soldier John Davis Billings' memoir, Hardtack and Coffee, bread or hardtack was often infested with maggots or weevils, which soldiers sometimes ate anyways.
Even when properly cared for, the crackers were incredibly tough, leading many soldiers to call them flour tiles, toothbreakers, and other names.
Coffee was a precious commodity, and troops had to learn how to properly secure it for marches. Green recruits often found their coffee rations wasted due to improper storage. Soldiers generally preferred to cook their own raw beef rather than have the company cooks do it, and the meat was supposed to be rotated by cut to the men. The most reviled meat was by far the saltpeter beef, nicknamed salt horse, which most men refused to eat. Generally, soldiers got salt pork for meat, sometimes of a questionable quality, but they made do. They also got an occasional ration of whiskey, though it usually wasn't much and hardly made up for the other deficiencies. Serving during the Civil War could get quite lonely. Far from home and cut off from friends and family, many soldiers found themselves wanting companionship, often of the opposite sex. Obviously, this was back in the 1860s, well before the days of texting, email, or social media, so soldiers had to get creative in their search for a pen pal. In her book, Busy Hands, Images of the Family in the Northern Civil War Effort, Patricia Richard describes the correspondence ads enlisted men would put in local newspapers seeking relationships. They'd often describe their physical features, hoping to attract a response, and there was a good deal of humor, too. Within just a few months, editors could be inundated with hundreds of ads from soldiers looking for everything from matrimony to fun. Many of the ads were humble and suggested strong middle-class values like good education, civility, and a strong character. After responding to an ad, the prospective couple would usually exchange calling cards and begin regular correspondence. Eventually, they might move forward to courtship, but that was far from guaranteed.
If I do not return, my dear Sarah, never forget how much I loved you.
In addition to love letters, soldiers also communicated by mail with their family and friends back home. No matter which side they fought for or what theater of action they took part in, most Civil War soldiers had hellacious experiences in battle. Death constantly surrounded them, and in some cases, 30,000 to 50,000 men would perish in a single battle. In Gerald F. Linderman's book, Embattled Courage, The Experience of Combat in the Civil War, he describes how, even under the most dire circumstances, a soldier couldn't show that the bloodshed and destruction affected them. Soldiers equated fear with weakness and were expected to show courage no matter what. For many, the epitome of bravery was for an officer to act unaffected by incoming enemy fire, steadfastly leading their men as hot lead chewed up the earth around them. Early on, even ducking, walking fast, or seeking cover from enemy fire while marching into battle was forbidden, and wearing armor could only earn you a round of teasing from your compatriots. Officers had to prove their worth to be respected. Even if you found yourself wounded, you were supposed to act like nothing was wrong and calmly walk from the battlefield to the aid tent. Showing pain was another sign of weakness. Some men actually showed off their wounds, thinking it would prove how courageous they were and perhaps even help them find a mate. When it came to wounded soldiers, the medical system was often pretty poor. While there were some bright spots, like the creation of a trained ambulance corps to carry the wounded off the battlefield, the rudimentary nature of the ambulance system meant some soldiers lay in agony on the battlefield for days while their wounds became infected or worse. And once they were picked up, they had to face the horror that was the actual field hospital. According to James M. McPherson's book, Battle Cry of Freedom, the Civil War Era, doctors and surgeons at field hospitals had reputations for being drunk and lacking medical knowledge. In fact, countless soldiers thought it better to avoid them altogether. If you did find yourself with a serious wound, your prospects for a full recovery weren't great. Being gut shot was basically a death sentence due to infection, and plenty of men found their wounds full of vermin or maggots that often had to be plucked out by hand. Outside of amputation tents, there would be piles of severed arms and legs. The hospitals were filled with men screaming in agony, and amputation was extremely common. For pain management, soldiers were given laudanum and morphine, two serious narcotics, saddling some soldiers with addiction issues well after the war ended. It's a sad commentary when the medical tent can be as scary as the battlefield, but such was the state of 1860s medical treatment. For most soldiers in the Civil War, combat was a terrifying prospect, and not surprisingly, some men took things into their own hands to avoid having to actually go into battle. According to Linderman, since running in fear was unacceptable and could get you shot by your own commander, some soldiers faked injuries or sickness, or even worse, intentionally injured themselves to avoid having to fight. Yet, to be caught giving yourself a war wound could end up having far worse consequences than intended. If nurses and doctors treating you at the field hospital suspected you may have shot yourself, they might amputate more of the limb than necessary, taking off your entire lower leg for a foot wound. Enlisted men also faked all kinds of illnesses and maladies like chronic rheumatism, heart disease, epilepsy, and tuberculosis, while others tried to sell their injuries as being worse than they really were. According to an article by Terry Reimer, published by the National Museum for Civil War Medicine, one soldier apparently shoved a turkey heart into his rectum to simulate hemorrhoids.
Turkey? Why turkey?
And others would swallow tobacco juice to induce vomiting. As with wounds, if nurses or doctors suspected you of fakery, they might retaliate, including giving unnecessary and uncomfortable treatments. Of course, soldiers who faked illness or injured themselves were considered cowards, but at least a few of them managed to rank high on the creativity scale. Many of the men who died during the Civil War weren't killed in battle, but instead perished from disease. For the Union, more than double died from disease compared to being killed while fighting, and more than 60% of the Confederacy's deaths were also from disease. According to Linderman's Embattled Courage, the experience of combat in the American Civil War, both armies consisted of recruits from both urban and rural areas. But the urban recruits had an advantage: community. Many rural recruits contracted childhood illnesses like measles and mumps when they began interacting with so many new people, which their urban counterparts had already experienced growing up in more populated neighborhoods. In addition, soldiers faced a gamut of other diseases, including cholera, smallpox, and tuberculosis, and the vast majority of soldiers had to deal with dysentery at some point. Ironically, hospitals were often the places where diseases spread.
What did they say at the academy about ward ventilation?
Ventilation.
Not only did parasites like lice and fleas run wild and spread infection, but only Union soldiers had wide access to quinine, leaving Southerners vulnerable to horrific bouts of malaria. Surgeons actually used bags of dirt to absorb the blood from wounds, which was hardly sterile. Obviously, they did the best they could with what they had, but looking back 160 years later, it's a wonder so many actually survived. The vast majority of soldiers fighting in both the Union and Confederate armies were male, but that didn't stop roughly 750 women from fighting too. At the time, women were prohibited from serving outside of a medical capacity as doctors or nurses. However, hundreds of women in both the North and the South bucked the system and fought gallantly for their side. According to Deanne Blanton's article, Women Soldiers of the Civil War, life wasn't easy for women in the Army, who lived in constant fear of exposure. Some of them, like Frances Clayton, actually served alongside their husbands, and in some cases came upon their dead bodies on the battlefield. They had to hide their feminine features, which wasn't easy considering the close quarters in which they lived. Luckily, most women weren't poorly treated when discovered, though a few may have faced time in military prison. Some women in disguise even became commissioned officers in the Union Army.
The truth is that soldiering paid better than nursing.
Since they were pretending to be men, women soldiers had to do all the same jobs and physical exercises without showing any difficulty. It often wasn't until they were dead or injured that their true gender was finally revealed, likely shocking their compatriots. Still, a bullet shot by a female soldier does just as much damage as a male, and many of them were likely deadly forces to be reckoned with. According to the American Battlefield Trust, for the average soldier, combat wasn't all that frequent. During winter, soldiers stopped fighting and settled in camp, and in the warmer season, they fought about once per month. The rest of their time was spent either marching, drilling, or in a temporary camp. On an average day, soldiers would wake up at the crack of dawn for roll call and breakfast, which was followed by some sort of drilling or marching. While at camp, some committed crimes like stealing from their fellow soldiers, while others were insubordinate toward their superiors, which could lead to severe punishment. However, soldiers also engaged in leisure activities like riding, playing cards, and gambling. Incredibly, pets were actually a frequent sight around camp, even dogs and cats, and troops could attend religious services led by a chaplain if they wanted.
You will be judged according to your actions and your conduct, declares the sovereign Lord.
Often, music could be heard coming from the camps. This was before recorded music, so if soldiers wanted rhythm, they had to create it themselves, and they definitely did. In addition to marching music and taps from the army bands, soldiers had their own instruments and made music with guitars, banjos, and more. Civil War camps could be a lively scene and a place to unwind from the horror of the battlefield, something most soldiers desperately needed. Some soldiers played games during their downtime. This included cards, horseshoes, boxing, and even a primitive form of football. Yet a particular note was baseball, which was one of the most popular games among the men. Baseball had been invented a few decades prior to the outbreak of the war and had some notoriety among Northerners, but weirdly, the Civil War is part of the reason it turned into a national sensation in the years after. When the fighting started, Northern troops would play against each other, even when they became prisoners, which is how it spread to the Confederates. Confederates saw the Union POWs playing, and many of them took it up themselves. Sometimes a battle would erupt while soldiers were playing and throw everything into chaos. Nonetheless, after the war, Confederates brought the game home, and everyone was playing in no time.
A pitcher is called a hurler. Fans are cranks, rooters, birds, and bugs.
Two of the most notable Civil War baseball games are the famous late 1862 game at the Salisbury Confederate prison in North Carolina among Union captives, and the Christmas Day game that same year in South Carolina among New York Union regiments. Supposedly, A.G. Mills, the future president of Major League Baseball's National League, played at the Christmas game, which, according to Smithsonian Magazine, may have been witnessed by 40,000 people. It was obviously a different sport back then, with underhand throwing, but the spirit of baseball was very real and lives on for many Americans today.